Okay, biscuits are really, really simple. There's flour. Let me just move this around a little bit here. Flour, sugar, baking powder. Baking powder is the thing that makes them rise up in the oven. We've got some salt here that I'm going to add in. Got some milk and some cream. We'll talk about each of these ingredients as I add them in. And I've got some cold butter in the fridge that we're going to use as well. It's really important that the butter is cold, cold, cold in the fridge. So I've kept it in the fridge until we're ready to use it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ingredients, and you're gonna have biscuits by the time we're done. And these are all ingredients that you probably have in your home already. And so biscuits are kind of a quick bread that you can make up at the last second. They're really best served hot from the oven. So they take 15 minutes in the oven. They take about 10 minutes in the bowl. And so 25 minutes before dinner, you can, 30 minutes before dinner, you can decide, something else I need. Just a little bit something on the side. You can whip up a batch of biscuits really quick. Okay, so we've got a bowl. We've got our bowl here. I've got the butter out of the fridge, nice and cold. You'll see that I have a sieve, just a fine mesh sieve here. And the reason I have that is because we want to incorporate lots and lots of air at every possible step. It's going to help make our biscuits light and fluffy and airy. So we're going to take our dry ingredients, and the amounts for the ingredients will be listed. I'm going to post the recipe for this on mishie'skitchen.com. So you'll have a written version of the recipe as well that you can follow along with. And all the ingredient amounts will be posted there. I'll also post a link in the description below to that web page. So there are 2 cups of all-purpose flour. All-purpose flour is the one that you probably have in your kitchen all the time. A cup of all-purpose flour weighs 120 grams. And when you're measuring your flour, you need to be very careful how you're doing it. If you've dumped your measuring cup into the bag, you definitely have about 160 to 180 grams of flour. If you've used a spoon, which is a common technique, and you've spooned the flour out of the bag and into your measuring cup, like so, you're going to have a much, much more accurate measurement of flour. You're going to be very close to that 120 grams if you measure your flour like that. And so I like to weigh my flour. And so just a really easy, basic kitchen scale. You can pick them up at even, any little department store, somewhere like that. I would get a digital scale because it's really, really accurate. You can get kind of, mechanical scales that work by weight on top and just turn a dial, but they're not nearly as accurate as the digital scale. So if you were to measure out of the bag of flour, you probably would have about 160 to 180 grams of flour. Measuring this way by scooping the flour with a spoon into the measuring cup and then leveling it off, you are going to be very close, and let's check, to that 120 grams of flour. And there I'm at 125. Really close. And it's really important that you measure the flour properly. You figure if a cup of flour is 120 grams and you're putting in 160 or 180 grams of flour, you're getting another half a cup of flour. And for every 2 cups, you're getting an extra half a cup of flour. That's really going to change how your butter and your milk and even your leavening ingredients interact with that flour. In a commercial kitchen, they always weigh. They will always weigh the ingredients, and it's a good practice to get into at home. But if you don't have a digital scale, the best way to measure your flour is with a dried measure scoop, and a spoon. Take the extra time. It does take a little bit, you know, a couple extra seconds, but it's well worth it. Okay, so there we go. 240 grams of flour there I have, which is good. I measured right the first time. You will make mistakes. I made mistakes. I grabbed the wrong measuring spoon and turned a batch of bagels into a batch of flatbread yesterday. So just take the extra time to measure carefully. Okay, into the bowl, 2 cups of flour going right into the sifter. You see I've got the sifter sitting on top of the bowl there. 2 cups of flour. There's 2 teaspoons of sugar. Sorry. And 4 teaspoons of baking powder. Don't get baking powder and baking soda mixed up. They are 2 very different creatures. Baking powder starts to work when you add the liquid, and it works again in the oven, which is why you get, sometimes they call it double action baking powder, because you get one lift when you add in the wet ingredients, and you get another lift when it hits the heat in the oven. And that's why when you make pancakes, that's a really good example of it. When you mix up a batch of pancakes, you can see that the batter starts to kind of puff up and rise in the bowl before it even gets to the pan. It's because the baking powder is starting to work as soon as you get that milk and eggs all mixed in there, and it reacts with the baking powder and starts that process. Baking powder. Okay, and then we are going to add just half a teaspoon of salt here. We're using salted butter because that's what I have in my house, because I use it for toast and bread and that type of thing. And that's probably what you have in your house too, is salted butter. So we're just going to cut back the salt a little bit in the flour. Anyway, just give that a gentle tap with your hand. You can see it's keeping all of the lumps in the strainer. All of the dry ingredients have gone into the bowl. So you can kind of push those through if you want, but there we go. And in the bowl then, you can see that it's just light and fluffy in there. It really gives the little bit of aeration to that flour, which helps when we add in the butter and the baking powder. It helps get the rise on the biscuits. The next thing we want to do is that we want to add our butter. And we've got half a cup of butter here, cut into chunks. There's a couple different ways that you can add the butter in. And in a recipe, it will say, cut the butter into the flour. And so there's a couple different ways to do that. And I'll show you what they mean to do. So first, we're just going to tip all those pieces of very cold butter. The important thing is to make sure the butter is cold, cold, cold. If your butter is too warm, you're going to make a flour paste with butter. And you're going to make more of a shortbready kind of cookie than a biscuit, because it's the butter in the dough that rises, makes little air pockets. When it hits the oven, the butter melts and makes a little puff of air, and a little hole in there where the butter used to be. And that's what makes the fluffy layers in the biscuit. One of the things it does. So before the butter starts to get warm here, a couple of ways to do this. Pastry blender. Do you have one of these in your cupboard? Does your grandmother, you came across this and said, what the hell is that for? It's for this exact purpose. And it's for cutting the butter into the flour. And see, you've just pressed down, and I've turned that one square into 4 squares. And you can do that again and again and again. And you end up with smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of butter. And that's called cutting the butter into the flour. And a pastry blender makes very short work of that. And you can get it done very quickly because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 knives working all together. If you don't have one of these pastry blender things, sometimes you'll hear people say, cut the butter into the flour with 2 knives, using 2 knives. And that's exactly what they mean. Use 2 knives, just like you're cutting into a bunch of spaghetti, and you're just cutting those big chunks of flour into small chunks of flour. It's a little bit more time consuming. You're only working with 2 knives, and so it takes longer, but it does work. It's effective. That's the way that hundreds of grandmothers have done for years. But when it comes to biscuits, we're going to use our hands. And it's not very often that I encourage you to use your hands in any kind of pastry, but biscuits are one place that we can do it quite easily. This is not a dough that can be done in a food processor. It's just too harsh, and you'll create that butter paste with the flour again. So use your fingers. And what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to just break that butter apart with your fingers. You're not trying to mush the flour into the butter. You're trying to break the butter into pieces. And so you can see that it's kind of breaking apart there, and you're getting kind of raggy little shapes of butter. And this takes a couple minutes, and this is probably the longest amount of time. Really use your fingertips. Try to avoid holding the butter in your hands. If you hold it in your hands, it's going to melt. So the amount of time that the butter is in your fingertips is seconds, really, and you're just, pushing it to break it into bits. Now, I use a lot of old cookbooks. I love the simplicity of them. I love the simplicity of the ingredients in them. I love the practical techniques and the way they really taught how to do home cooking with minimal equipment and really basic ingredients. And so I use a lot of old cookbooks, and you may have a couple old cookbooks at home too, maybe passed along from other generations. And I always laugh because my favorite biscuit recipe that I've built my grandmother's off of says to mix the butter with the flour until it resembles soap flakes. Well, I don't know about you, but the last time that I saw soap flakes was on an episode of The Little Rascals. So that's not much use to me. I can imagine what soap flakes will look like, but in person, I've never seen them. So it's a little help to me. And I talk a lot and I don't get a lot of work accomplished here, but you can see how it's starting to come together, and there's little wee bits of the butter is breaking into smaller and smaller bits. So I don't know what soap flakes are, but I know what this is supposed to look like when it's done. And so what you're really trying to accomplish, if you think of almond flour, almond flour is really kind of like a heavy crumbly flour. Think of very fine cookie crumbs. You can feel it. That's why using your hands for this recipe is such a good idea, because you can really feel how the pastry changes. And so just make sure that you don't have any huge lumps of flour, and I think we're just about there. And I'm going to show you a close-up here of what we've got. So if you can see that, we're like almond meal there. Like really, it's dry. The butter is not melted. It's just really almost made like almond flour is the closest I can get in my mind. Okay, so there we are. That's the butter and the dry ingredients mixed together. And the next we're going to add in our milk. And I'm just going to give my hands a quick wash. I'll be ready. Okay, so we've got milk. And in our house we use 1% milk because it's what my family likes to drink. But that's not quite enough fat content to make the biscuits really light and fluffy. It makes the milk makes them tender. And so we need that fat content in the milk to make sure that they're getting enough tenderness in the dough. So what I do at home is I mix 1/3 of a cup of the 1% milk with 1/3 of a cup of table cream. And so I end up with 2/3, but it is a mix. You can use buttermilk, you can use, you can use 2% milk, whatever you have, but it is, you do get a better biscuit if you've got some extra milk fat in there. So 2/3 of milk and cream, and I'm going to pour this right in the bowl, but I'm going to reserve maybe the last third. I'm not going to pour it all in. Your flour is going to take on different amounts of liquid depending on the humidity in your house, and flour changes every day. You can open a bag of flour on Tuesday, and on Wednesday you make the exact same recipe and it's going to require half as much liquid, and on Wednesday maybe it's going to require double. So I always hold back some of the liquid. It's easier to add more in than it is to take some out, which you can't actually do. But you can see that that's come together now. I would say when you feel the dough, there are little sticky spots. I'm not going to put the rest of that milk in there. I think that we've got enough in there. If I put much more in, they're going to be heavy and dense. So I'm going to stop there. And we're going to let the biscuits set for a second to absorb in that, for the flour to absorb that milk. What we've done with the butter and the flour is to create layers. And once you add in the milk, you're activating the baking powder, but also you're creating gluten structure with the flour. And you do need a little bit of structure, that flour to have some structure to hold it, to hold the rise in the oven. So you do want to work this dough a little bit, but ever so gently. And we're going to work it in a way that's going to add in more layers of lightness into the dough. So I've got a little bit of bench flour here, and so we just call a little dish of flour that we keep on the side for dusting the work surface. Very, very lightly. We don't want to really incorporate more flour into this dough. We just want to keep it from sticking to the counter. So we're going to bring it together. We're going to press it, and we're going to knead it. But we're not going to knead it like bread flour, which is like that heavy, get your upper arm workout in there. We want to be very gentle. And so think of a puff pastry where there's layers of dough and layers and layers and layers. And that's kind of how we're going to knead this dough, so that it gets lots and lots of layers. So fold it in half, press very gently, fold it in half, press. And I only do about 6 times. That's it. That's the most you're going to want to do. Any more than that, and I'm trying to find my bench scraper here. And you're really going to have overworked the dough. So we've got 2, 3, and by folding it over on top of itself, we're really working in some additional layers. I mean, you can see them, they're big and heavy now, but there's 4. Get a little squish down. There's 5. And 6. And I'll stop at 6. And I always like to start with a nice square dough. And I'll show you why in a second. All right. I love these little bench scrapers. They're perfect for getting all the additional little crumbly bits off the counter. A little bit more flour on there. And just a dusting on top. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, there's a couple of different ways you can do, there's a couple different ways that you can form your biscuits. You can press that all down with your hands, which I figured out was one of the mistakes that my grandmother was making. She just pressed it all down with her hands, and while she was doing that, she was smashing all the butter and the milk and the flour and making the dough all tough and developing the gluten too much, and her biscuits didn't rise nearly as much as they could have, and they weren't quite as light and fluffy as they should have been. So we're going to use a rolling pin. Keep our hot hands off that dough now. We're done working with it. We don't want to screw around with it anymore. We don't want to mess around with it anymore. We want to just get them in the oven now. So a little bit of flour on your hand, not on the dough, on your hand, on the pin. You don't need gobs of flour. You really don't. And it's just gentle. Roll it a couple times, give it a turn. Gentle. You want to use a little bit of pressure because you got to get some pressure on there. You can scoop up a little flour underneath. Here we go. If it's starting to stick, just dust that again. You want to roll this to about 1/2 inch thick. And I know that estimating when you're at 1/2 inch can be a bit of a trick, but my father, who was very clever with trying to teach me little life hacks, taught me a little trick that I'm going to teach you. So I like to keep my dough very square if I can, and I don't want to play with it too much, but I like to start square. And I'll show you why in a second. But if you look at your thumb, from the tip of your thumb to your knuckle, your first knuckle, is about 1 inch. So if you take that thumb and tuck it up against the side of your dough and you come about halfway, you're probably about 1/2 inch. And I think we're there. The more you work with recipes and dough and rolling things out, and pies and that type of thing, the better acquainted you'll get with exactly what a measurement looks like. But I like that little trick of using my thumb, and it kind of, there we go, 1/2 inch. Now you can, if you want, and my grandmother used to use a soup can, and she used to cut out her biscuits, and I've done some here, round ones. You can do that quite easily with a biscuit cutter. Ideally, you want something very thin, very sharp. That's why a tin with the edges, the top and bottom cut off, works pretty well. I use a beer glass, which probably is not as sharp as I would like it to be, but my biscuit cutter has mysteriously gone missing. So in a pinch, a beer glass worked well. So you can do them round, which is kind of the traditional shape for them. I like to do mine square because I am a firm believer of rolling biscuits once, and anybody who makes biscuits will tell you that that's the rule. And so I like to do a square so that I can cut square biscuits. And so I use this little bench scraper and very evenly cut this dough into, we're going to get 9 out of this one. This is a small batch of biscuits, but you don't really want biscuits hanging around for days. They're kind of a eat them the day you make them kind of quick bread. So we're pretty, I mean, if you were really picky, you could even these up. But the reason that I make them square to begin with is because I don't want any waste. So if you make them round, you're going to cut out all those circles, and then you're going to have scraps. You can press those scraps together and cut another round of biscuits out. They're not, that second round is not going to be as light and flaky as the first. I promise you, it's just not going to happen. They're not going to have a consistent texture. They're not going to be light and flaky. And if you only use the first cut of biscuits, you're going to be wasting all those scraps. So I like to do mine square. It's just economical for me. And you can see all those layers all kind of built in there from the way we've put it together and folded it over and kneaded it together and rolled it out. I don't want to horse around with them too much because we got to get them in the oven. There's no time to waste now. That baking powder is already starting to activate with the milk that we added. So when you place your biscuits, and I've got just a cookie sheet, parchment paper. If you get one thing from this video, get yourself some parchment paper for your kitchen. You'll love it. It will save you cleanup. It will save you burnt biscuits. It will save you burnt cookies. It's my #1 kitchen tool. I could, go without my KitchenAid, but I couldn't go without the parchment paper. I love it. So place the biscuits very close together. And the reason we do this is because it's going to help them rise more evenly. And they're going to force each other up, really. And some people say that you should have them touching. I don't think that they have to touch, but very close together is ideal. Okay, so we have a preheated oven, 425, hot, hot, hot. As soon as these biscuits hit the oven, that heat's going to get in there, melt that butter, and then activate with the baking powder, and we're going to get that instant rise. So we want hot oven, 425, 15 minutes. We're going to check them. Do not open your oven door. Turn on your light and look through the little glass to see if they're brown, but do not open the oven door until you're at about 14 or 15 minutes. All that extra steam in the oven really helps them to rise up and get browned. So in we go. Okay, so these biscuits are out of the oven, and you can see that they have risen up quite nicely, and I have a little bit of melted butter here. I love to do this at the end when they come out and they're still hot. Just top them up with some melted butter. Get all coat the look. I just have to do this here. I got to show you here while I'm touching this. Look at all the flaky little nooks and crannies. I'm going to bring it up there to the camera for you. Look at how flaky that is. That's perfect. That's exactly what we're going for. And yet the shapes on them are a little bit, not what you're used to. Maybe you're used to more of these round ones like I did earlier. But I love that there's no waste, because there's always somebody who wants to eat a biscuit while somebody else is doing the dishes after dinner. So I always want to get as many biscuits as I possibly can out of a batch. So that's biscuits. It's pretty simple. Nothing to it. We're going to be doing a few really great dishes that go with biscuits coming up. So you've got those square ones like that. You've got the round ones. They all go nicely together. You cook them that way, pack them that way, dish them up that way, make people think that you've gone to the trouble of making 2 different kinds of biscuits. No, you'll have a debate at the table. Somebody will think the square ones are better than the round ones, and the round ones are better than the square ones. But only you'll know that they're the exact same biscuit. Have fun with your family. And have fun around your dinner table. That's really what it's about. And I always say that the little extra time and dishes that it takes to put a meal together, to spend some time around the kitchen table, enjoying the company of people you love is worth it. And you can even turn that dishes time into something fun too. So, you know, enjoy the time. And if it doesn't turn out, it doesn't turn out. It's not the end of the world. It's biscuits. Try again tomorrow. Try again next week. Wait a month and try again. You'll get it. Sometimes things just take practice, you know. And sometimes you do things for a really long time. Like these lovely bagels here. I'm going to get them just to show you. When you grab the wrong measuring spoon, and I knew this was going to happen before I even got them into the fridge for fermenting. You get the wrong measuring spoon and you end up with really great flatbread, but not great bagels. So, so even people who've been cooking for, you know, a really long time mess things up. So don't worry. Have fun. If you have questions or comments, email me, message me, send me, you know, a comment below. Make sure you put the like button, subscribe. I'm kind of new to this whole YouTube thing and how the whole video thing works, but you know, like, subscribe, follow along, leave a comment. Go to missuskitchen.com. I post recipes there. I try to get 1 or 2 up a week for you so that you've got something new to try, something new to make, something new to inspire you to try something new. And I'm always available to answer your questions or to help with kitchen problems. You know, if you're struggling with a recipe and need help, message me. Let's see what we can do. Let's get you cooking. Yeah. So thanks so much for following along on this first video. There's going to be a whole lot more practice before I get to chocolate chip cookie class, I think. Anyway, have a great rest of your weekend.